Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us again. Last session of the day, as we call it over here in the UK, the graveyard shift. But I think we're far from that with some guests from over the other side of the pond. So I'm really pleased to be welcoming Grant and Megan from the US. I'll let them introduce themselves and let us know where they're streaming from at the moment. Megan, you first.
Sure. So I brought my tea for the occasion, just so you know. And I'm streaming from West Palm Beach, Florida area, a little town called Jupiter. And I have come to you with 15 years of internal audit experience across 3 public companies and 1 private venture capital held company. Today, I don't work in an internal audit role. I work in a finance systems role where I administer and implement software systems to support SOX testing and compliance processes. So that's kind of where I'm coming to you from today. And I've expanded the breadth of SOX in my career. I was in college when the law was passed, but my whole career has been in a SOX world.
Cool, thank you. And we're gonna dive into a bit more around that. And the whole purpose of the session really today is to help some of our clients over here in the UK where we're about to face some very similar legislation to Sarbanes-Oxley. So I thought it would be really useful to get some insight from our colleagues and friends over in the US. Grant.
Hey, Richard. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining today. My name is Grant Small. I am president of Legion Star, who is a key partner with Turnkey here in the United States. I'm based out of Chicago, Illinois. We focus on ERP controls and security management, everything from Sarbanes-Oxley to identity and access management, ERM, etc.
Cool, thank you. So it's great to have you guys on the session today. I guess sort of kicking off, everyone in the UK has heard the term Sarbanes-Oxley. I think even people who are not in our profession, but maybe you could give us a little bit of background as to kind of why that legislation was introduced, and perhaps give us a little bit of insight into why we might be facing something similar ourselves over here soon.
Right. So to boil it down, it really comes to public trust in the information that's published from the companies they're investing in. That's the real short version of it. And if you really research it, there's a bunch of companies, Enron specifically, but WorldCom and others that abuse that trust in the past. And so this legislation was put in place in order to protect the integrity of the information stockholders and investors rely on.
Cool.
Free to add some more in there if you want.
No, I think it's similar here.
Yeah, I think the key thing also is that now effectively the law has been in place for over or almost 2 decades now. It's a scenario where it's now become a part of, if you're a publicly traded company, it's part of your furniture. It's part of the being within the organization, and controls and how you manage your management of those controls is a huge part of everyday processes. Gone are the days where you could do things, and not really look at how things upstream and downstream would get impacted. Sarbanes-Oxley, brought a lot of those types of process issues to the forefront, and actually helped some companies get a better handle on their efficiencies and their processes overall too. So it was a large undertaking, mostly founded in the fact that the U.S. had some true trust issues with some publicly traded companies, but I think in the end there was a payoff.
So I mean, thinking about I guess thinking way back now, when the legislation was first introduced, how did that affect U.S. companies? What did they need to do?
Right. So that impact right at the beginning, 2003, 2004 was huge. It was a huge impact to a lot of companies. You see huge cost numbers that came from that era. And that's it's because they didn't have the fundamental processes in place in order to preserve the integrity of the financial statements that are being published. So they had to put in that whole system really fast. But when they did, they probably did a bit of overcorrection. So it was more of instead of really knowing where the target was, because no one had done this before, they threw all the darts at the board, right? So they probably picked up everything that looked like a control in the whole global scope of their company and threw it on a page. And then, okay, now we're going to test it internally as management. We're going to also have our external auditors testing it. So that's a whole crew of people that didn't exist before. So you have to pay them. So you see the big cost shows up that way. And it at first wasn't strongly targeted towards taking a measured approach. It was more just let's get something out there and let's go. And then it kind of toggles back and forth between really, really strong overcorrection to dialing it back down a couple years later. And that kind of, I like the way Grant said this yesterday when we were talking, throttled back and forth a little. So it kind of goes a little bit stronger in some years, a little bit less strong in some years, and then we realize we're not doing enough and we go back to a correction state. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how it's been going over the past 18-ish years.
Yeah, I mean, we've had, obviously, we're working with a lot of companies over here that have a US listing, and it's a globally applicable piece of legislation, isn't it? So if you're SEC listed, you have to be SOX compliant from a global perspective. So, we've Turnkey, to be honest, has been built on the back of a lot of SOX requirements, because that kind of, around the time we formed the company in 2004 was around the time the legislation was coming along. So, off the back of that, there's been huge compliance activities and initiatives over here as well in response to the legislation. I'm thinking about the level of sort of effort prior to SOX and then post SOX, and in terms of maintaining your compliance after after having achieved it. What would you say to that in terms of the level of kind of effort that's been for the organizations you've been involved in?
Okay, so compliance after we've already established it sounds like it should be just easy and you're just cycling in place, but it never has been my whole career. Every year something steps up, something pushes farther in the envelope. So I know, like I said, when I first came out, everyone's throwing all the darts at the board and massive efforts undertaken immediately, which it's good, but it wasn't all necessary, right? So we had to dial it down a bit. But then what happens is, for one, given no changes in how auditors audit and no changes in the Sarbanes-Oxley guidance out there, you still have organizational turnover. So this is in acquisitions and divestitures also throw into this. So you have new people who come into their role and they maybe didn't get the right knowledge transfer from the person before them. And so when they're performing controls, or maybe they didn't know they were supposed to perform a control, there's always some upkeep there. So you always have to continue to train people, continue to lift up what they're doing throughout the year, keep the cycle going. That you start with your risk assessment and kind of a gap assessment of what's going on with the controls, phase 1 testing, phase 2 testing, update testing at year end. And you have to keep touching over and over again with your control owners and retraining those who are new. And when it comes to acquisitions, these are the normal organizational changes that organizations just go through. You might acquire a company, a former company I was part of. We acquired a significant company that was going to be significant on our financial statements in Montreal, Canada. And being in Montreal, Canada, they had never been subject to SOX. They were not a public company traded on the SEC. So really quickly, I had to work in French and try to get them to understand what SOX was and get them up to speed on why we do this, get all their controls documented, and then get the controls to be working effectively, because those are two different things, right? You first have to identify your set of controls, and then ensure that the steps they're taking are effective. And so that's kind of the normal upkeep that happens all the time. Mm-hmm. Then the changes that go on with how, so I don't know if you're familiar with the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. We call it the PCAOB. They're the auditors of the auditors. So our external auditors get audited, and the things that the PCAOB concentrate on change over time. And so that changes how our auditors audit us. And then therefore we have to respond with maybe new processes or new ways to document everything. And then there's also auditing standards that change over time. So there was a AS2 world that was kind of in your overcorrection state. And then we went to AS5 and it got a little bit less intense. And then it keeps going kind of back and forth with the regulation and as to how deep and how much effort you require to do the testing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, I guess we've kind of seen a lot of these projects, turn into a project with an army of consultants on them, etc. What are your thoughts on how much internal versus external effort there is to get compliance here, and what are the upsides or downsides to those different approaches?
Well, I guess if I can take that one, I mean, I guess one of the stories I tell about early SOX years. I was manager of internal audit at Citrix Systems, and I remember going to a holiday party, and I was standing there with my wife, and I had a ton of people come by. And effectively, they always said, how can you be married to this guy? All he does is push us around and ask us to do all these changes to our processes. And I'll add all these extra steps that make me sign on the dotted line that I looked at this report, sign it, and then I come around and beat him up for it again. And that was year one. And then year two at the holiday party, it was totally different. They actually came over and we were actually drinking together and whatnot versus having them come over and hitting kind of nagging me a little bit, but it goes to show that at first it is a Herculean effort, and you touch every single aspect of your business. There's not many that are kind of considered outside of the realm of Sarbanes-Oxley, or that wouldn't be necessarily financially significant. In the States, Megan, you may know this off the top of your head, but I think it's like, if it's any more than 15% of your total net revenue, it counts. So you need so any process that would drive that net revenue from a financial standpoint would be in place. Mm-hmm. So you start touching all of these different business applications and teams, and you can't really take any one of them for granted. So it took a Herculean effort to cover all those in the first place. But what we learn now is that we don't necessarily need that. Is that we can do it with some specialists, and by chopping those groups up into manageable areas by business or by application, if you're looking at IT. And there's a lot of different ways on how you can kind of stratify your Sarbanes-Oxley approach, or your financial risk approach, just like anything else. Megan, I don't know if you got anything to add to that, but yeah.
I do. So 15% is a number I don't think I've heard before, but I think it really hinges on what your external auditor is heading towards. So I know had a 5% revenue swinger on a few of the public companies I was part of. So like one of the entities, Japan, always was on the edge of 5% based on their foreign currency. So 1 year Japan was in, 1 year Japan was out. You might recall that. So I did get to go to Japan one time because it was in that year. But really, for the sets of consultants, there's two schools of thought on that. One is get the controls experts in. They can do it most efficiently because that's their heart and soul, and that's what they've been doing for their career. And get it done, right? Just get it in, get it done, make it a one-time cost, be done. And then management can theoretically just upkeep what that is, or you just keep the consultants on every year. So that's an option. The other is to really do it internally and have those consultants come in to help you. And there is an emphasis on management being the one performing the controls and management ownership of the internal control over financial reporting. And obviously your lead person on your certification is going to be someone in-house. They're going to sign their name. So it kind of hinges on that person, how they feel about whether they want the external resource to be doing everything or if they want their people to own it. But the real how it rolls down is that if management owns it, like if the internal company people own it, they really get to know the nuts and bolts of it, and they understand why we're doing this. And it's not kind of like what Grant experienced, someone coming around and pushing them around and things. They really begin to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. And that actually is a much greater long-term result, because they own that, and they actually begin to take ownership and say, because they're the process experts anyway. Let's say your external consultant group came in and they said, oh, in this AP process, you need 17 controls. But the person who owns the AP process can look at that better and say, no, these 4 or 5 controls really cover all of the assertions we're trying to cover for our financial statements if you just isolate those by themselves. And the external guys, they don't really know your process. So they're coming in kind of blind and they're going to throw everything at the board again, And so even if you did that, you need someone internal to kind of rein them in and watch what they're doing. And I've had experience with this at one of the public companies I was part of. It was their second year one as an independent public company. They had gone private for a little bit, and then they went public again. We brought in a crew of external Big Four consultants. They threw, we already had 175 key controls. They threw 120 more key controls on the board. And I personally took those 120 and I said, no, this one duplicates this one duplicates this. We've got that assertion covered with this other control. Even that crew came in and they gave me 4 copies of the same control in their list of 120 controls. So even if you're throwing a group of consultants at the project, you really do still need internally to manage them. and I had a director on the project that was supposed to be doing that too, but me as the internal person, I know my process is much better than they ever will. So
yeah, I think that's a really key thing. It might sound counterintuitive for a consultancy to be saying this, but I think the ownership of this, and therefore a lot of the legwork from a project perspective, with strategic guidance from external, with understanding of how you might reinvent some of those controls to make them more efficient. But I think that it's important to recognise that there's a level of effort and a level of magnitude around the effort of managing your controls that will be different afterwards and needs to be owned internally. It's not this external company that's going to help you get this project over the line isn't going to be the one that's going to have to put their name on the line and sign that attestation to say that you're compliant. That responsibility is always going to lie with the organization, isn't it? And therefore it's really important that your organization starts to learn how to take that ownership from day one, and that's part of the transformation of the project. It's not it's not all about having a load of consultants do this to you or for you.
Yeah.
Picking up on the sort of technology side, what role do you think technology has played in those types of projects, and how has technology made these projects easier, harder even? How have you seen that sort of play out?
I love this question, and I think that's because I'm a recovering auditor turned systems person. So kind of a fundamental thing you have to identify when you identify your set of internal controls is your automated controls, your partially automated controls, and your manual controls. And when you are testing, this becomes very clear to you, because for an automated control test, it's often a lot easier to test and get confirmation that the automated control is working. You got configuration settings, a kind of a test of 1 to make sure that it flows through the way you expect, and then you can kind of close the book and move on. Where a manual control takes a lot more effort to test. It's sometimes 45 samples you have to take throughout the year, and it can't be, just the first half of the year. You have to wait till the year end when everyone's scrambling for everything. You have to go finish more testing. So from a testing perspective alone, that makes a huge difference. And so the world of, we do reconciliations in Excel, and then we somehow manually identify all of our reconciling differences, and then we put that in a different Excel, and then we hopefully present that right schedule to the right person for their quarterly review. That's all very hard to test from a control perspective. If you have a system to do your account reconciliations that automatically produces a report of your reconciling items and has a workflow that goes from one person to the other for that person to formally sign off on their understanding of the reconciling differences, it's much, much easier to track. It's much, much easier to test. And so that's just one example of where going from, and it's probably something most finance professionals can identify with, going from a worksheet version into an automated version of a control. And then there's also the technology where you have applications that automatically monitor some of these things. You have continuous monitoring capabilities in them, so you can kind of monitor certain risks. Specifically, I'm thinking of some cybersecurity monitoring tools that exist out there. And then those are easier to test in your environment. Also, anything, but then that makes it easier. But some of the new things like robotics process automation or AI are making it probably the process easier, but the control gets a lot tougher to test and to monitor. Because somebody who's monitoring that control and testing that control has to really deeply understand how the robotics process automation or the automated or the artificial intelligence is working, which is a totally different skill set. So I got a couple of parts of that take. Looks like Grant has some other thoughts.
Well, no, I agree with you on the RPA side of the house. We're seeing more and more of our clients want to go that route. And the reason for it is that just straight away, there's no overhead from a, labor standpoint. If I can lock in an automated control and I know it's going to work effectively all the time, and I don't have to worry about, Megan, running the report every, week, then I have a win-win for everybody. But to your point, the issue is that I have to have strong change management. I have to have very strong application, development. I have to make sure that I go back and test those controls, effectively, almost at the same frequency that I run some of these other RPA-based controls, and that's a tough thing to do in some organizations. We have some organizations that get it and have very, very tight processes around IT, but I don't recommend that for companies that effectively have, less mature controls around change management and some of those other key areas of IT. Yeah.
A lot of the work that we've done over here for clients has been helping them to operate some of those controls more efficiently with technology options around controls automation and stuff. I think one of the things that we've seen quite frequently as well in more recent times over the last 2 or 3 years, a lot of clients have purchased some of these kind of specific AI tools and are using them to do things that they could have been doing with their existing technology investments. So, if you've got things like SAP GRC process control, you've got things like ServiceNow tools, then a lot of the continuous controls monitoring capabilities they have are able to do the type of automation that you might be using a Blue Prism or a UiPath or something to achieve. But I think if you're not careful, from what you described as well, it's very easy to get yourself in a position where you've got a lot of work to actually monitor and audit some of those tools. So if you can stick with one or two key tools that you're going to use to do that activity and work within the confines of them, it will also mean that the auditing of those tools becomes a lot more straightforward for you as well,
Right. And in the situation where, we do a lot of work with, SAP GRC and Okta and, SailPoint, Savient, those types of tools that help the auditors or help the process stay in control. Those governance tools also have to have their own ITGC frameworks. They have to have their own controls built in. And so now, you're adding one to help out the business, but now you have to add more controls on top of that system, just to keep it in check. And sometimes that's not apparent at face value whenever you're implementing it in the front end. You kind of forget about that, but a very important point. So,
just thinking about what the kind of consequences are. So, I mean, over here in Europe and in the UK in particular, we're just evolving this kind of legislation. So we know that it's going to be mandated. We've been given some recent guidance over the last couple of weeks, but it's still not, a formal legislation that we have to comply with. We just know that it will be in the near future, and we know roughly what we're going to have to do. But as a result, we don't know the consequences of not complying yet. So just a question for you guys. I mean, it's a leading question because I know to a large extent myself, but hearing it from yourselves, what are the consequences of non-compliance? What have you seen happen to your kind of, not necessarily peers, but organisations in the US who haven't complied with Sarbanes-Oxley and have been found not to?
Okay, so starting out, what usually happens is if you have enough problems in your internal control framework that the external auditor has a concern, they will publish a significant deficiency or a material weakness in your financial statement audit letter, and usually that's a big crash for your stock price. So, and then that kind of rolls down. So when that falls apart, the company leadership has to look to, okay, what do we need to do? And a lot of times that has rolling impacts into the organization because the stock price drives a lot of decision making at the lead levels. If you have
we've estimated that most material weaknesses cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 to $300K to remediate. That's in US dollars. Once they're identified. And that's because normally there's such a very stringent external audit need. So your external auditors are going to need more hours. Mm-hmm. Your internal team is going to need more hours to remediate it. You're probably going to need to make some changes to IT or to your processes. There's a ton of things outside of that, or a ton of outside costs associated with remediating those issues. And, that's just added cost. So, the best prescription obviously is to, not get one in the first place and stay on top of it, from the get-go.
I mean, fundamentally as well, the legislation actually makes the directors of the organization personally responsible for internal control, doesn't it? So, in the worst case scenario, that could really come home to roost for the directors of the organization, right?
So in theory, the controls letter is signed off by the CFO and sometimes the CEO. Mm-hmm. I have not heard of a case, Megan, you have, but I've not heard of a case in probably 5 years where there's been any situations where a direct legal scenario has been pushed against the those representatives of the company. Now, what I have heard is that, board of directors and those same individuals, the C-suite has been held accountable on some civil levels. So, instead of it being a PCAOB or a governmental statute that caused the lawsuit, it was more of a loss in, like what Megan said, 3 or 4% of the stock price. And a group of investors get together and end up suing those individuals directly. So it's, I know the States is pretty sue happy, or they like to litigate, at the drop of a hat in a lot of cases. But, in this case, I've seen quite a few of those types of scenarios pop up in the last, couple of years.
Right. I haven't seen I'm not aware of any cases recently either, Grant, but I do know that sometimes in this amount of career I've had as an internal auditor performing the Sarbanes-Oxley testing, managing the Sarbanes-Oxley testing, I come across individuals and organizations occasionally that just don't want to do it. They don't want to comply with the controls, and they don't want to put the controls in place. They don't want to document what they're doing. And once in a while, probably 3 times in 18 years, I've had to pull out, hey, you should know that our chief financial officer signs his name on a document that says our internal control framework's in place, and he could go to jail. and they tend to just finally listen. That's like a last resort. But they did actually listen once I said that, because most of these people did report through the CFO branch of the company. So eventually, I had to use that as a way to get their attention to say, we really need to do this. Usually I haven't needed to do that. Usually they just go along with what they need to do. But occasionally you find those people and they need to know.
Yeah. And the other thing too is, it's not real good for your career either. I mean, if you have a material weakness that, effectively spans, a couple quarters, that probably means that you're not really in control of your processes in the first place. So, if you're a CFO or, a controller that's trying to make, upward progression in their career, you don't want a governance issue on your resume, right? And those are public. So it's not like the next company is not going to know. So, it's those are kind of the downstream ramifications that kind of drives management to make the right decisions.
It's a good point. Yeah. And it's the public record of it as well. So, yeah. So just one final question before we kind of move to some of the audience questions that we picked up along the way. If you had to give some benefit of hindsight advice to some of our clients over here that are facing this type of legislation over the next couple of years, are there any kind of key nuggets of insight that you might give them, words of wisdom, as it were?
Okay, I'm going to try to be short, but I don't think I can. there's a lot.
Couple of great ones yesterday when we prepped. So
let me start with this. Take a look at the COSO framework. You're required as a public company to say that you comply with something, COSO or something like it, but there's nothing really like it. So COSO 2013 is the beginning framework for everything else. Everything else falls under the COSO 2013 framework. So start to dig into that. Start with that. The next thing I would say is be cautious about the overcorrection, like I mentioned. And the way to do that, I think, because you have the breadth of experience that's gone on with any SEC filing company, I would look at guidance on control rationalization. Like if you're going to set up your list of controls, you don't want to fall into that throw all the darts at the board category. You want to really rationalize what you set up as your initial control listing. And rationalization, I've done it at a few different companies. The best way is really to look at your control assertions within a set of transactions and make sure you've covered all the control assertions for that set of transactions in a control. So that way, that methodology tends to help you get it back down to what you really need versus what you want. You can have those other controls as mitigating controls. They're good to know on the record, but your key controls are the ones that cover the assertions for that set of transactions. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of getting the fundamentals there. And then kind of more recent pitfalls that we've stumbled through and several companies I've been part of are the two biggest PCAOB findings when they audit the auditors. They find problems with management review controls and with key report usage. So I'm going to start with management review controls. I used to test controls in an AS5 world where I would just go look and see, did the guy sign the report once a month? Okay, so if we handed this person a 500-page report on open POs every month and they signed it and they wrote their name and date, I would consider that to be a pass on a control test back in the day. Can that person actually read a 500-page report? What are they doing with it? What is their threshold for investigation? We didn't ask any of those questions back then, but today the expectation is that you do. So a management review control, anything where somebody reviews a set of information, such as a 500-page open PO report, you have to really understand what they're doing to know if that's an effective control or not. So they just sign it, that may not be effective. They're not really getting you anywhere. So that's management review controls in a very brief nutshell. And when you write those controls, the absolute best practice is to say their threshold for review is anything over that X number of dollars, 5,000 British pounds or whatever it is that they use as the threshold. Write that in the control. Write down the fields that they review. So if they only review 3 of the 4 columns, or if they only review 3 columns and there's 12, write down which columns they're looking at. And then to be really best practice, you write down what they do when they find an issue, how they go track it down and make changes and all that in the control language.
Hey, Megan, as a benchmark for the folks out there, if you take one division, because I know the company you currently work for has many, but you think about like one finance, sales, HR, etc., and IT, and you talked about like how many key controls that one division has to manage. How many key controls would that division have?
That's really complex. So IT controls are a whole different animal than the rest of the controls usually. And I really think of it, Grant, in cycles versus functions and segments and things. So kind of if you go to like a procure to pay cycle, I used to have something like 18 to 20 key controls in that cycle. And that's really dependent on really having a complete control environment that's the same. So not just my current company, but many of my companies have had distinct control environments. So you might have a procure to pay cycle over here, and that one is completely different than this procure to pay cycle over here. So you might have another 18 to 20 controls over there. And procure to pay is high risk because it's cash going out the door. So it's probably one of the heavier hitters. It's probably bigger.
But to kind of back into this and what you're kind of saying, the thing that I wanted you to say is that if I take purchase to pay and then I take order to cash and then maybe I take my RevRec process or whichever cycle I'm talking about, you're thinking about these in maybe 20 or 30 controls per process. You're not thinking hundreds of controls. And that's what I want to kind of leave the audience with, is that our process is now, at one point in time, like in the early 2000s, we were at the point where some organizations had 1,300 controls, and now we're down to 200-300 controls in an organization, and that's the right number, and that's key. So it's not so much about covering everything as it is picking the right spots and making sure that the right individuals are there to help you identify those key controls.
Right. Totally agree with that. 200 to 300 that's actually kind of high for some of the organizations I've been part of. But again, it kind of depends on how varied your control environments are within the organization. And that's kind of, if you have a different set of systems and processes in one part of the organization as another, those are 2 separate control environments, and they're going to have different sets of controls. So
I just wanted to pick up a couple of the, sorry to interrupt, I just wanted to, before we wrap up, just pick up a couple of the audience questions, because there's a couple of good ones in here.
If you can give me 60 seconds to go through the key report thing, just really quick, this is the other biggest pitfall you can hit, is people relying on key reports in their control and not understanding the key report. So maybe they're using that 500-page open PO report. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe it doesn't have all the data that you need to have. Maybe the data is being published into the report incorrectly. And there's lots of ways you can produce a report. And the other thing is trusting the other person who handed you the report without doing your due diligence. So a lot of that, and you can really find a lot of research on how to document key reports, or sometimes it's called IPE. And it's very detailed. It's a lot of effort, and it's something that a lot of people overlook as they implement their key controls.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So there's some great insight in there, guys, and I really appreciate that. Just picking up one, there's one here. Do I need a controls platform? This is from Cindy. Do I need a controls platform? Will we struggle with SOX without it? What are your thoughts on that, guys?
I think I missed the last couple of words.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Richard. Can you repeat it again?
Do I need a controls platform? Will we struggle with SOX without one? I guess the question is, can I do this on a spreadsheet for some companies?
Okay, so I think I can probably handle this one. I've worked with a couple different tools to do this, and I've also worked for most of my career in SOX testing without it, without a software platform. So you can do it without a software platform. The Microsoft suite of products is pretty good to handle all that with shared documents and tracking and all of that. I will say it's far, far easier if you have an implemented solution to host all of your controls. I've implemented Teammate Plus before. I've implemented Black Line Compliance to support the SOX processes, and that ensures a level of consistency throughout the process. So in the Excel world, you send out an Excel template and you ask people to document their things in the Excel template, and you hope that they do it in a similar way that you ask them to, but you have no control over that. From a systems perspective, you can make drop downs and you can make locked fields and all those things that you can control the output better with a system. And then it's much easier to report on year over year how the control was performed and tested over time using a system versus having it all in spreadsheets. But if you're brand new to the process, just getting something in place is probably the bigger priority over having something in place supported by a relevant system.
Okay, cool. Thank you. A couple of other, who's auditing the auditors we covered earlier. Do you have any advice about how to influence the auditors to what you need rather than what they have, just having to follow what they say? I'll take that one, actually. I mean, I think the key there is to make sure you educate yourself around your own controls. If you're constantly responding to what your auditors are telling you is wrong and you don't understand it yourself, you're not able to push back and you're not able to explain that the way you do it is okay and it achieves the same control objective. So if you actually kind of go back to the control objective, there are a number of different ways to achieve it. But if you don't understand the control objective, you don't understand how your controls achieve that control objective, then you're always going to be on the back foot with an auditor who is fundamentally just trying to kind of probe you to understand whether you're operating controls you understand, So I think it's important to understand that, there are a number of ways to achieve control in your environment. And if you understand how you're achieving the control objective and you can explain it, then you're always going to be on the front foot with an auditor. They're not always going to know better than you, that's for sure. I think the UK...
if I can throw one more thing in on that. I mentioned you want to document your list of key controls. Most likely the external auditor, PwC or EY or whoever it is, will come to you and say, here's our list of key controls that we're going to test. And you should do your due diligence to compare those and understand what they feel is key that you don't feel is key and why. I've had success in the past challenging that list of variances of things that the external auditor wants to add in as a key control to test that we don't consider key. And it was understanding, just like you were saying, Richard, it didn't understand the full breadth of the control environment, and we did. So we were able to talk them down, and that reduced cost all around.
It's making it a conversation, isn't it? It's not a one-way thing. Auditing isn't something that's done to you. It should be a process that you work through with your auditors to and to help them understand how you do things and help you understand what they're expecting you to do. It could be a two-way conversation, and when it's effective.
Right.
And one of the key things that, one of the roles that we play a lot is we're kind of the client advocate for, the companies that we work with along with the external auditor. So, we stand with our client and have that conversation with external and really make them justify why they want to make those changes or add those controls in some cases. That's important to have on your side is, have someone with some controls experience like Megan or that can challenge the auditors, obviously not, in a hard way, but, in a logical way and say, what are we gaining from this? Because we have to think about the business too. I mean, as auditors or controls, implementers, everything that we do is going to add labor and overhead to our process. So if that means it's 3 hours a month or 3 hours a week, that adds up quickly and there's a cost associated with it. Sometimes external audit doesn't care about those things. Sometimes it's we need this because we need this, but they aren't real clear on what the justification is. So it's okay to push back and have those conversations to get to the right level. And having someone on your side really pays that off. So
absolutely. I'm going to allow us to overrun just a couple of minutes because I've got one more question from Andrew here. We're being challenged on the number of controls from US subsidiaries. They're quoting approximately 50 to 70 for a diverse subsidiary. As the framework has matured, there's been a move towards high-level review controls. Does that really provide assurance we're looking for? So the question fundamentally is whether high-level review controls are, considered effective from a SOX perspective. And I guess, looking at the UK, is that going to be considered inadequate?
So I'll say this. A lot of people want to rely on the detective controls. So there's preventative and detective controls. And a lot of auditors, external auditors feel, or the PCAOB feels, that we are, as companies, relying too much on the detective controls. And so what you call the big catch-all controls that you can kind of go, oh yeah, well we look at the P&L flux every quarter. That isn't going to get you there on, is our revenue proper because we took the order properly and we have the right controls at the front end of the order to make sure that the customer has agreed to the terms of pricing and the quantity. And so you can't get to the point where all the big, huge detective controls are everything. You need to have some preventive controls in there as a balance.
I think something I've realized over time as well is when you're introducing some of these automated controls that you've got available to you these days, the line between a detective and a preventative control is blurring quite a lot. Because if you're monitoring something frequently enough and detecting it and doing something with that detection frequently, in the timeliness manner, then if you're getting that timeliness right, you're able to turn a detective control into something that's far more like a preventative control. But I think I do take your point that those kind of high-level reviews and reporting reviews and those kind of detective controls where they're very much manual as well. There's a lot to be can leave a lot to be desired in terms of the amount of control they're actually achieving, can't they?
Yeah. Well, here's my 2 cents, and this is what we coach our clients on, is that, to Megan's point, again, it's a lot about balance. But when we have a subsidiary anywhere, it doesn't matter if it's US or abroad, we have the tendency to put more controls on that group because it doesn't have the same connection that a lot of the the corporate or the headquarters processes have. And in some cases, things can slip, or I'll put it this way, things may not add up. And if all I'm doing is getting the trial balance report at the end of every quarter and using that as my super key control, that's correct. Well, how do you know the controllers aren't on the take and fudging the numbers on the trial balance, right? So you have to have the right level of controls all over the org to make sure that it's correct. And I know as of late there's been a high push to do more high level reviews, but I think again, to Megan's point, you got to have the right balance.
Thank you, guys. So I think we'll wrap up there, because we're over time a little bit, and I'm sure you've got busy day jobs to do as well. It's the last thing on on Thursday here as well in the UK. So thank you very much for taking part. It's been really useful hearing how things are on the other side of the pond with this topic. And let's hope that we can turn some of this stuff into a positive over here and learn a lot from you as our colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.